some milestones, get through the slides, and then hopefully leave some time for questions. I know there's some questions that were posted, and I'll try to, if they're not answered in the slides, get to those at the end as well. So again, first, going over fine motor milestones. Like with any milestones, this is just kind of a guide to see where your student should be. Hopefully, it's not set in stone. There's a lot of things obviously that can go into if they're meeting these milestones. A lot of, if they're exposed to fine motor skills, what the culture is like of the family. So this is just kind of a guide that we use when we look at fine motor development, and it's hopefully a guide that you can use to kind of see where your student should be based on their age. I really like the picture in this slide because it really, the X-ray shows the hand of a typical 3-year-old, and you can see all the space there where the hand hasn't fully formed as the adult hand has. So we can see, when we look at fine motor skills and how they develop, why there is such a discrepancy, even from a 3-year-old to a 6-year-old, and what we can expect them to do and what they're able to do. But by 2 to 3 years, when we're mostly seeing some of our students in early intervention, turning a single page of a book, they can start to imitate and copy, hold a crayon, and using scissors. And again, this is a guideline. I think especially with scissors, when I worked in the clinical setting, a lot of times when we ask families about scissor use, they would kind of look at you a little crazy, like, why would you give my 2-year-old scissors, or why should a 3-year-old have scissors yet? But again, this is just a guideline, kind of saying that developmentally they should be able to do this if they're exposed to trying. By 3 to 4 years, we look at being able to imitate a block design, folding paper and making a crease, imitate across a copy, or imitate and copies across. So we start seeing intersecting lines. I'll talk a little bit more about kind of the developmental progression of handwriting later on in the slideshow. You can start to draw a 2-part person, grossly coloring, so not really adhering to the lines much, but we see more of that scribbling at this age. And then we start to use scissors, not just to snip, but to advance them forward. 4 to 5 years, we start seeing work in diagonal plane. They can start crossing the midline more. We start seeing the basic shapes emerge, like a square and triangle, 3-part person, and then starting to use the scissors to cut a circle and a square. And the big difference here for the scissor use is we start to incorporate a bilateral coordination portion, where they really have to use both hands, because one hand has to help manipulate and maneuver the paper, while the other hand continues to cut. So that's the big change when you see scissors is do they have that bilateral skill to manipulate and move the paper to keep the scissors on the line. By 5 to 6 years, this is kind of where we're getting into our kindergarten ages. We should see copies of triangle, imitates rectangle. Their person is becoming more complex, and that's a good indication too that we use as therapists. It's a good indication of what their body awareness is. How do they see their body in their own mind? And that's a huge part of coordination is do they have that mind's map of their body, and is it in place? And so we tend to see kids that have this underdeveloped also have poor coordination, because they just really don't have that, what we call the body scheme, or that mind's map of their body in place. So if they can't really represent or draw and represent a body on paper, they might not have that good body awareness. And we can talk a little bit more later about how we can help develop body awareness, where that comes from. And then seeing the complex shapes, or cutting out the complex shapes. And what we can see as we go on here into the older years, there's not a whole lot of changes in fine motor skills. It's just adding more of a cognitive component to it, and being able to cognitively be able to handle more. So like when we look at like writing, the first step would be tracing, and then being able to copy what they see and represent that on paper. Be able to copy a dictated sentence would be the next cognitive level, and then being able to come up with their own sentences. And you'll see that as they get older, because as we have to think less about the motor component of it, and the motor component of it becomes more natural. We can allow more room for increased cognitive demand. And that's what you'll see. And again, in the 8 to 10-year-olds, we'll see more typing at this age. One of the questions that was asked about the developmental milestones and how it's changing as we move more into typing, and there's less focus on writing. There's been some pretty good research that's been done that shows that we really retain information a lot better when we write it down. And there's a lot of theories as to why that is, but the act of forming the letters just takes a lot more cognitive ability. And there's actually some additional research that's saying cursive in itself activates more of the brain than just printing. And cursive is becoming kind of a lost art, but you'll see it as a strategy that can be used for some students that have difficulty with handwriting. For certain populations of students, cursive is an easier way to handwrite just because we're not lifting the pencil up as much off the paper. It flows a little bit more naturally, and it can kind of address some of the spacing issues that we see with some students. I know some students with dyslexia, dysgraphia, have had more success with cursive writing than with printing. So it's a tool that we can definitely try. By middle school, we're kind of at that developmental age where, you know, it's going to be more difficult to make changes in fine motor skills, especially when it comes to handwriting. A lot of these motor plans are ingrained at this point, and unless you have a very motivated student to improve in these areas, it's pretty difficult to address grasping patterns and letter formation and sequencing when we get into this age. But here are some of the milestones that we have for these. And again, looking more at just increasing the cognitive demands of the writing. And then same with high school. From a therapist standpoint, you know, when we look at, if we were to get a referral for a student in these older grades, we're looking more at, I guess when we do therapy or any sort of therapy, we always kind of rehab to the point where we can't rehab anymore. And then we try to bridge the gap. If they're still not functioning where we'd like them to be, we bridge that gap with adaptations. So at this age, we're really looking probably more at, you know, what adaptations can we make to make writing easier for them, whether it's talk to type if we can't write, dictation methods. Again, writing is ideal because research shows that we retain information better when we write and take notes, even more than typing. So it is important, but we can do strategies like fill in the blank notes where they just have to write in keywords that they need to remember, or different adaptations like that have been successful in the schools. So after the milestones, we look at some of the interventions that we recommend often for our fine motor skills in the classroom, and a couple considerations before this. I really like this slide. It's one that a picture that we were told in grad school, and it's one that I like to kind of tease our physical therapists about a little bit, because it shows how the body would be represented proportionally by the amount of brain that it takes to operate. So you can see that our hands and our mouth and our eyes really take up a huge part of our motor cortex. Our hands are a real precise tool, and when they work well, we kind of take for granted just how complex it really is. You know, the things that we do with our hand, whether it's typing or knitting or kids playing video games, there's just it really is, you know, amazing what our hands can do and what a complex tool it is. You know, in the world of prosthetics, you know, it's still kind of the golden standard to be able to make a prosthetic that can actually completely mimic the human hand, and it's something that with all the technology we have, they still have not mastered. Definitely getting much closer though. So it's a good representation of just how much work goes into writing and into our fine motor skills, and how much brain power it really takes for these kids that are learning and that are struggling with it, to have to invest in it. So pre-writing shapes is kind of what I talked about earlier. This is the development of how we write typically. Some kids can get stuck in some areas, and some kids can, you know, kind of blow past some of the areas. So it's really not a set in stone, but typically this is what we see is kids will do vertical and then horizontal lines, making a circle. And we can kind of see this with how when they draw too. We'll see, you know, that scribbling, they'll scribble horizontally and vertically, and then kind of doing the round and round circle will be the next step. Intersecting lines is a huge part for handwriting, and then making the diagonals and the intersecting diagonal lines is usually the last to come. And a lot of that is because there is a crossing the midline component to that developmentally happens later for us. And then again, looking more at the development of writing and coloring and what we would expect to see and how it typically progresses. Again, this is just a guideline. It's not specifically how it's going to always be. For grasp patterns, there's some, you know, conflicting research on the importance of our grasp, but I will say that the way that our hand is designed is we have, you know, 3 nerves that innervate our hand. What we really want to see is the ulnar nerve, which is our pinky and our ring finger. That's really where our power comes from. That's where we get our stability from. And precision is really meant from our radial nerve, which is our thumb and index and then middle finger. So that's really what we want to see grasping. When they're involving that ulnar side of the hand, they're not really going to be able to do that precise movement, and we'll see a lot more fatigue later on. So the mature grasp pattern, the lateral and static tripod grasp, the dynamic tripod grasp, the big difference is when we talk about a static tripod grasp, the movement isn't coming from the fingers, it's still coming from the wrist, elbows, or shoulder. The dynamic portion of that grasp is when we start to see those small finger movements, usually with the thumb, going in and out to make the movements. And then the more distal or proximal portion of the upper extremity is stationary and used as to stabilize. And really, when we look at grasp, it really is just kind of a quest for stability. And you can see, that immature grasp, that whole-handed grasp, they're just looking for a lot more stability. When you get those extra fingers on there, like you see with that four-finger grasp, again, they're just trying to find stability. So it's really important too, when we look at handwriting, to address the stability as well, and to make sure that they have good core strength, good shoulder girdle strength, because it really is important if you want them to have precise fine motor movement. These are some considerations prior to intervention. We always want to make sure the child's set up for success. There's a lot of different seating options in the school, but we really want to make sure they're at 90 and 90. The paper is angled, the desk isn't too high or too low for them, so they're not having to reach up. And that, again, posturally, they're supported. We really, in the clinical world and in the educational world too, it's really important to look at, what the environment is before we have them do the activity. We use a lot of dynamic seating in the school, which is great for some of our sensory kids, but it's not really a great thing to be incorporating when we're trying to have them do handwriting. I would consider doing a standing desk instead if that's something that's needed, just because if we're really challenging that proximal stability, we're not going to get as much distal control. An analogy I always like to give parents is if you think of the hand like a crane, when a crane has a very stable base of support, so it can do precise movements at the far end of it. If it was on an unstable base of support, any movement from that base is going to be amplified significantly from the far end of it. So if we have a weak core, or if your child can't sit upright, then we really need to look at other ways that we can support them posturally so that they can be successful when it comes to fine motor activities. And that's really kind of a bottom-up approach, but it is important to have those foundational skills beforehand, because we're really not going to get anywhere if they don't have core stability, or if they don't have the core stability, that initially, then we're providing some sort of seating option that can provide them that support. And the other thing is, I always look at, do they have the right tool for their age? We tend to use small pencils for small kids, and that's good. When these little hands have these really long pencils, that's a long lever, and that can affect their handwriting as well. Do they need a grasp or a grip on it? Is it the right size for them? So just making sure that they have the right tool for their age. And I think with anything, handwriting, especially when it's hard, it can be difficult for kids, and fine motor skills can be very frustrating for kids. So how can we make it motivating for the student? I think one of the great things that AI has done for us is we can kind of customize almost anything now. I have AI websites where you can type in any prompt and they'll make you a coloring page. So you could do Mario fighting Luigi in a swamp, and it would give you a coloring page of that if that's what your child is motivated by. So really finding what motivates that individual student and trying to incorporate the handwriting into that. I think with anything, you'll get the best results and the best effort if the child is motivated to participate in it. So I'll start talking about some specific fine motor concerns and then some of the strategies that we use in the schools to address that. Hand dominance is a big one. And this is another area where there really is a lot of conflicting research as far as when should a child have a dominant hand. I've seen as late as 7 years old, children can still establish a dominance. I am a big proponent of not forcing dominance, and we tend to do that almost subconsciously. If we're right-handed, we kind of assume that someone's going to be right-handed, and we tend to hand them tools on their right side or place things on the right side. So I think if a child at below that 7 age is still struggling with dominance, it's going to be very important that we present tools in the midline and see what they grasp with. It's good if they start an activity with a certain hand to see if they can finish. We'll see kids switch hand dominance for a lot of different reasons. If they are switching hand dominance whenever they have to go to the other side of the paper, that's probably a midline crossing issue. If they are switching hand dominance because of fatigue, that's another thing to consider, especially at a young age. But a lot of times we can see what their established dominance will be um, with other things that aren't fine motor skills. A lot of times I'll ask parents, if you were to put food on the table, what hand would they feed themselves with? And that tends to be their dominant hand. Um, Not always. Usually some people are cross dominant where they'll have different dominant eyes and ears and feet, but a good way you can look at like eye dominance is have, look through a telescope. What eye do they put it up to? If you have them, someone's talking into the room, go put your ear against the wall and see if you can hear what they're saying. And then what ear they put up to the wall will be their dominant ear. So there's other ways we can kind of trick out what side is likely going to be their dominant side, but we really don't want to force anything. And then kind of like we talked with the scissors, we can label one hand as our working hand, that's our dominant hand, and then our helper hand, which is going to be our stabilizing assist hand. And so you can put a sticker or a marker and have them just give that extra visual prompting cue as to what hand they started with or what hand they have been using most of the time. But if it's still kind of like a 50-50 split, we don't really want to force anything. Let's let them kind of hopefully neurologically discover that on their own. Poor pencil grasp. This is probably a lot of our referrals. We'll start with just giving visual prompts and hand over hand assist, seeing if they can get their fingers into the right position and maintain that position. Working on a vertical or slanted surface, a lot of times we'll see kids that kind of curl their wrist in. If we put them on a slanted surface or even a vertical surface, that'll force them into wrist extension, which will promote a more mature grasp pattern. Another tool that we use a lot, like I talked about, trying to really isolate the precision side of our hand and having our stabilizing hand stabilize, is you can put a small cotton ball or a bead or something or a coin and see if they can hold on to that with their pinky and their ring finger for the duration of the writing activity, and that'll help them stabilize and get their fingers in the right position. You could put a mark or a rubber band around the pencil to where they should grasp it. Again, when I look at pencil grips, I try to personally stay away from those with the younger kids, like I had talked to you before. I think we really want to try to rehab to the point where we can't anymore, and then we try to put in an adaptation when we've kind of stopped making progress. So, like personally, I would say 3rd, 4th, 5th grade is when I'd start looking at using grips if we still do not have a functional grasp pattern. And then I'll get small pencils, triangular pencils I really like too. I think that helps kids maintain a better grasp. And then being mindful of, are they using the appropriate pencil pressure on the pencil? You see kids that kind of white knuckle it and they're squeezing so hard on the pencil. We can give them like a foam insert on there to see if we can loosen up their grasp, or if they're writing too lightly, that can be an issue as well. And then just making sure that they're grasping the pencil at the distal portion of the pencil so they have the most control. A lot of times kids will just kind of automatically grab the pencil really high and we just don't have as much control if our fingers aren't towards the writing surface. Scissors and cutting, reposition and visually explain how to hold the scissors and keep the arms to the side. A lot of times what we can do is we can have them hold a piece of paper or a folder under their elbow. And if you keep that on their side, that can kind of help them keep in the appropriate position for it. Placing a sticker or a mark on the scissors so that they can see that, so they know that they have to cut with a thumb up position. Bolding lines, trying different paper thickness. Sometimes a more like a cardstock can be easier to maneuver because of manipulating the paper will be easier with a thicker card. It would take more strength, but from a coordination standpoint, it'd be easier with thicker. And then bold lines, and starting with snipping and cutting. With all of these things, repetition is the key to coordination. So the more practice they can get, and if that's just snipping in a sensory bin and just making a bunch of cuts, that's good. The more we can go over that motor plan in our mind, the more it'll become ingrained. And problems with space, and this is probably one of the hardest things to fix from a fine motor standpoint, because there's a real big visual perceptual component to this as well. It's not just a fine motor thing, but this method we tend to use more of a top-down approach, where it's a lot of real cognitive strategies. We can use an actual spacer, whether it's another pencil or we have actual overlays you can put on the paper to kind of give them space. Again, we talked about the cursive earlier and implementing cursive writing so they're not as much picking up the pencil. Highlight boxes, you can put words in the boxes. No touch rule for any of the letters. And teaching students that every word has its own bubble. And I think this is really important because this probably more than any fine motor issue, especially with handwriting, affects the legibility and the readability of the work so much. You know, if you can just have the child space out words, even if their letter formation is poor, it makes their work a lot more readable. So I think this is one of the biggest things that I look at trying to fix, because even if we, you know, especially in the older population where we really, that those motor plans are kind of ingrained, if we can improve their spacing, we can really improve the readability of their work. And I always try to overshoot. I'd rather have them overspace. So that's another way we can do it too, is really over exaggerate the space we put between words, and then they can kind of whittle it down as they get more proficient of it and really get used to that. Letter sizes, there's a lot of different strategies that we can use for these. We can use the boxes. There's a lot of great online things where you can print off whatever lessons you need and add letter boxes to it. Different styles of paper, wide ruled paper. I think, you know, having kids write in free space is really hard for them. So I have them use line paper, put lines in all the paper for my students, and until they get probably out of elementary school, really, because organizing that open space can be really difficult from a visual perceptual standpoint. We also have tactile paper where the lines of the paper are slightly raised, and that can kind of give an additional cue to the student, you know, where the letter size should be. And then highlighters or bolded lines to kind of further emphasize the where the letters should be. And then also just higher contrast. You know, sometimes using a highlighter can give them an extra visual prompt to see where that letter should stop and start. And the same thing with line placement, bolden the lines, giving them tactile lines, darkening the lines, individual box for each letter. Kind of the same concept for the line placement. I think when we look at some overall difficulties with handwriting, I think it's very important that we are consistent. I think using consistent language, I know in Duluth Public Schools, we use printing like a pro, and that has a verbal pathway for each of the letters. And I think that's one thing that was important for us to use, so that if a child is struggling with writing and they're being worked with by an occupational therapist, and they have a para helping them, and they have a special education teacher helping them, and they have their general education teacher helping them, I think it's extremely important that we are all using the same language when we have them write the letters. So the printing, like the pro verbal pathways, are very helpful, that everyone is on the same page, so we're not confusing them as far as how we're going to sequence the letters. And there's kind of a going against teaching kids capital letters earlier from a developmental standpoint. You know, going back to those early, how we developmentally progress. Capital letters are much easier for us to write than lowercase letters, because there's a lot more straight lines than there are in the lowercase alphabet. And then even looking at how we teach the alphabet, you know, if we teach the alphabet in alphabetical order, it is definitely not the developmental order of teaching letters. You know, the developmental order, we would start with letters like I and H. E and F would be our first letters, and A would be one of the last letters, because it takes two diagonals and an intersecting line. So if you look at the developmental progression, if A is our first letter, they might not developmentally be there. And then B and C as well are also much more difficult letters to write than are, you know, developmentally appropriate based on where they're at. Again, those straight line letters would be the first ones to learn. And then if you look at lowercase letters, obviously with the curves of those are going to be much more difficult than any of our capital letters. So if our student is really struggling, going back to just starting with capital letters until they are developmentally ready for the lowercase letters. And this one I really love, the multisensory approach to learning letters. I think the more that we can incorporate all of our sensory systems into how we form letters, the more successful students will be. I think it's really, there is a great place for iPads and things like that for learning how to sequence letters, but the way that our body learns about itself is really through our tactile system. Our skin and our proprioceptive system is how we develop that mind's map of our body that I talked about earlier. And so any way that we can incorporate more sensory input while they learn letters is going to be better. I would 100% prefer chalkboards and chalk over whiteboards and whiteboard markers, because you just don't get nearly as much sensory feedback if you're writing on a smooth surface that doesn't provide any real neurological feedback. Because we really want to look for for any coordination is we want to see a shift from a feedback to a feed forward response, where when we first learn something, we are relying on the feedback of our senses to kind of develop what our next step is going to be. when we have an ingrained motor plan, we don't have to rely as much on our senses. Our body feeds forward what we need to do. So like, for instance, when you teach a child how to tie their shoes, when they first start doing it, they have to look at their hands and they're really kind of muddling through it, and it takes a lot of process. But as they get proficient in shoe tying, as most adults and older children can do, they can tie their shoes with their eyes closed. They can tie different types of shoes. They can tie boots, or tennis shoes, because they have that feed forward ability now, where their body isn't relying on all that sensory feedback. So I think especially for these early stages, when we look at development of our fine motor skills, to incorporate as much sensory input as we can, whether that's um, writing in Play-Doh, writing in sand, using our finger, using small tools and a toothpick to write our letters in the Play-Doh, painting, finger painting, are all great ways to incorporate other senses into our writing. But again, old chalk and chalkboard is a great way. A really nice strategy that I learned, it's actually from a program called Handwriting Without Tears, and it's called Wet, Dry, Try. And what they do is they take a chalkboard, and it's a great fine motor activity because you get a lot of repetitions in, but you take a very small piece of chalk, you take a very small sponge, and then a crumpled up piece of paper towel. And even the act of crumpling up the paper towel for them is a fine motor exercise. And so the wet, dry, try is, I would write the letter first on a chalkboard. They take their small sponge and they erase that letter. So they're going over the same sequence with the sponge. They have to use a small pinch on the sponge. They're going over that same letter. And then that's leaving, on a chalkboard, it leaves a clear mark where it's still wet. So then you take your crumpled up paper towel, they go over that letter a second time now. So now they have two repetitions, two different fine motor skills, working on that nice pincer grasp. And then the third time, after you dry it, it'll leave kind of a shadow of the letter on the chalkboard still. Then they can take their small piece of chalk and then trace that letter. So you get three repetitions, wet, dry, and try. And it's a great way to kind of get a lot of sensory feedback into writing and really help develop that motor plan for them. Going from gross motor to fine motor is also a good strategy, where air writing, and then having them use big gross motor movements to write the letters, and then going to more small fine motor movements. Building the letters with Play-Doh, building letters with sticks or popsicle sticks are also great ways to kind of help learn, develop those motor plans and help them transition from that feedback to that feed forward. Copying from the board is another one that we see, increasing the size. With this one, I think one thing that we really want to look at with kids, if they're having a difficult time copying from the board, is their visual motility. And motility versus mobility just means the quality of movement. So we really want to see, do they have the visual skills to copy? Can they converge and diverge on a target? We see a lot of kids that they can't separate their eye and their head movement. They really don't have those, because again, the eyes are also a fine motor area. The muscles around our eyes are fine motor muscles that we use to move. And if a child can't dissociate their eye and their head movement, and their eyes are stuck, or they can't converge and diverge in a target, they're not going to be able to copy from a board. So that's an area, that's the issue. And that's one of the only issues I would really look at, the fine motor skill of their visual motor ability and their visual motility. Is that affected? And do they have the underlying skills to be able to do that? Another one is decreasing clutter. I know a lot of classrooms can be very busy, and we see a lot of, especially our sensory kids, that just have a hard time tuning out any other information. So if there's a lot of other visual stimulus to look at that might be more exciting than the writing, that's going to be difficult for them to kind of filter that out and focus on what they're doing. Here's just a list of references that were put together with, actually this slideshow was put together by we have an OTA student in the district right now, Jet, who did a great job putting together this presentation and putting together the slideshow. So I really want to thank her and acknowledge the work she did on this, because she did a great job putting together the slides and finding all the information for me to present to you guys today. I know it is 3 o'clock. I will try to get to some of the questions here. If you have to log out, I definitely will not be offended. One of the questions, what's the most effective model for a push-in strategy in the general education setting? I think, this really is so variable. It's really, for me, I think it's having the relationship with the teacher and trying to find times where they're going to be participating in those fine motor activities. And hopefully that the teacher, if they give you a time, will stick with that time, and that actually happens. But I think pushing in is the ideal strategy. But finding times when they're already doing those fine motor activities. Um, Somebody asked about a top-down versus a bottom-up approach. I think this is kind of really going to be based on the age of the students you're working with. I think, you know, a bottom-up strategy looking at develop those early on developmental stages is going to be important for our younger kids. And I also think as an OT in the Duluth Public Schools, where we do a lot of indirect service, I think that's really a great opportunity for indirect services that, you know, if we can go in and work on, you know, using those small prints of grass, how can they incorporate that in the classroom, and understanding that, you know, if you're, let's say you're using Q-tips for doing a painting activity, let's cut them in half, and so they have to really get a small pincer grasp on that Q-tip. So, or just, you know, can they incorporate some weight bearing throughout their day, whether it's animal walks or bear walks, to help develop that stability and that strength in the shoulder girdle and in their core. Some of those things where the teachers or the pairs that have more access to the students can incorporate on a daily basis is really going to be more effective. And then I think for the direct time, it's almost more of a top-down approach and looking at you know, some of those cognitive strategies, or what can we do to kind of help them improve, like I talked about with the spacing. Other overall developmental trends that have changed the world of fine motor, given that cursive isn't a thing anymore and typing is more prevalent than writing. I think that kind of remains to be seen. I think, you know, like I said, the research out there shows that we retain information better when we write it down, and there's a lot of reasons for that. But I think it's still pretty new as far as, you know, this move towards more work on whiteboards, more work on smart boards and iPads, and less, you know, tabletop or actual written work with paper and pencil. But I do think with anything with coordination, I always like to tell my students, you know, that repetition is the key to coordination. So with all this stuff, you have to continually practice over and over again for it to really get ingrained. I do a lot of coaching, and I always, you know, when I explain to the kids that I coach, you know, if you want the best athlete in your sport, doesn't just go and make one free throw and then call it a day. They do it over and over and over and over again to really get that ingrained. And I wouldn't expect that with handwriting, because it's not nearly as motivating. But, you know, when we look at you know, what our expectations are for the students, you know, how many times are we affording them to be able to practice this activity, you know, to really get the, you know, understanding how complex the hand is, and what a complex, you know, skill handwriting is. Are we really giving them enough time in their classroom to practice this, to really get those motor plans ingrained? Someone asked about senior high student intervention, or senior high interventions for dysgraphia when they don't qualify for OT. I think at that age, we're really looking at adaptations for the student. I think, you know, if we really want to work on writing, I think going back and finding what's motivating for that student. I know in the past, when I've worked in the clinic with older students, you know, writing letters to like their favorite celebrity would be a way that we get them to handwrite. If they are into sports, you know, writing down stats or doing things like that. Would, you know, finding something that motivates them to write. Journaling could also be a great motivation. And I try to start real easy with journals. You know, what was your favorite thing the other day? What was something you struggled with? What's something you look forward to tomorrow? And doing a quick journal like that each day for them, just to give them an opportunity to write, I think is an effective way. But, you know, when we're looking at those really much older students, to really change how they're going to write is going to be very difficult. Someone asked about, as a SPED teacher, what assessments can I do to support documentation or need for evaluation? I think really the best thing that I rely on is, I just like to look at their classroom work. I think we can get, the nice thing about elementary schools is so many teachers post things up in the hallway, like the work they've done, and you can kind of go through and be like, you know, looking at this different work that the student has done when they know they're not being watched, and you get a really good idea of what their skills are. Because you'll see, you know, when the OT comes and we're looking at handwriting, they will definitely, when they know you're looking at it, they're going to do their best. They might not do how they would normally write. So sometimes just looking at just everyday classroom work is the best way to really assess, for us to see, is there a need for testing. Someone asked about how to build muscles in the hand for writing. I think we talked about that whole-handed play is fantastic. I love sensory bins. You know, digging in dirt, digging in clay and Play-Doh is a great way to start developing that strength. Weight bearing is another fantastic way. Crawling up inclines, crawling through tunnels. You know, having them work on an easel. If they're doing a tabletop project, tape it up to the wall and have them do it on the wall instead. I think is another great way to start developing that hand strength and also that more proximal strength, so they have that ability to participate in those distal control activities. I think that is the questions that I had submitted beforehand. If anyone has any other questions right now, and definitely stick around for a little bit and answer.
Amazing. Thanks, Jason. Yeah, anyone feel free to go ahead and type in the chat window or feel free to unmute yourselves and speak as well. Getting some thank yous in the chat window. So yeah, if there are no questions, of course, feel free to log off, but we'll hang around for another couple of minutes to see if there are some. And I'll go ahead and stop the recording.